I'm going to start our recording, and I am going to start, and then people can just join us as they come in. And thank you so much again to all of you for joining me for part 3 of our story in 10 t-shirts. So you can see that I have 2 different t-shirts behind me today. I always find this difficult, like, so here. So we've got on this side, Democracy, the established 1948 Civil War collection, Israel, Autumn Winter 23. And on this side, we have a dove in a flame. And the text reads Demokratia Umeret, which is the slogan that you will hear sung in some of the videos. It's either democracy or mered means revolt or revolution or upheaval. And that was kind of, in a sense, for me, this is the t-shirt of the moment that we are going to be capturing in this session, because it really felt like this moment of pinnacle of Demokratia Umeret. When is democracy done and when does revolt start? And we will look at that in detail today. So I'm going to share my screen again with you, and hopefully that means this time I won't forget to share the sound, so we won't have to do this all several times over. So now I can still see you all. I'm gonna put you all on mute, not because I don't love you and because you can't unmute, but just because that way we get a little bit less background noise. And if you do have a question or want to make a comment, just feel free to unmute again. You can absolutely do that. So we are today in session 3. I've entitled it The End of Democracy, the Reasonableness Clause. And as I just said in the intro, it's really that moment where it felt like we had reached the pinnacle. So let us just remember what we kind of did in session 1 a little bit. Either for those who missed session 1, I will share all the links with everyone for the recorded video so that you can catch up. But where did this all start? January 2023, Israel's Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, introduces a package of legislation to overhaul the judicial system. And there were 4 points to this overhaul. The standard of reasonableness, and we'll look at that in greater detail today, because this is what today's session really is about. Then the question around the judicial selection committees. We won't really go into detail. This is something that is still ongoing. Then the override clause. Events have sort of taken over. We're not quite there yet. So luckily, but the override clause was a proposal that the Knesset would have the authority with a simple majority to overrule any judicial decision. And then the final one was the transformation of legal advisors into political appointees. Whereas at the moment, the role of a legal advisor to a minister is also not just to allow the ministry to implement policy, but to ensure that the ministry actually complies with law. So it is the role of the legal advisor at the moment to say, you can't do this, and stop the minister from doing stuff that is supposedly illegal. And they want to change that into political appointees, which of course would totally undermine that. So we're going to look today primarily at the standard of reasonableness. But in order to understand this, we have to take a short moment to understand what are the basic laws in the Israeli legal context, because that's of critical importance here. So although in the Declaration of Independence, it had stated very, very clearly that a constitution should be approved, that this would be the next step. It said so on the 1st of October, 1948. It completely failed to do so. There was no agreement reached on a constitution, certainly not that early on, and not since. So instead, what happened was that in 1950, the first Knesset, so this is the first, when I talk about the first Knesset, I don't mean like the building, the Knesset, but the first government that was elected, decided to enact what it called basic laws, which would kind of take the place of Israel's constitution. However, unlike other constitutions, basic laws can still be enacted and amended as if they were regular laws. So they only require a simple majority of members of the Knesset. And we have to remember that in the Israeli legal system, in the Israeli system of government, you are only in government if you have a majority of Knesset votes, right? It's a single chamber. You need at least 61 of the 120 seats. So by definition, if you are in government, you have a majority of members of the Knesset. So there is no further separation of power. There's no second chamber, no president with actual powers, purely representative powers. So therefore, really the basic laws have no greater status. There are a few clauses that require a special majority, but other than that, everything else is just, it's a basic law because it talks about things that are not just sort of a simple bill, but it doesn't actually have any status higher than or requires any higher hurdle than any other law. So the first set of basic laws that were established really set out basic governmental powers and institutions. So they defined what is the Knesset, what is the executive, what is the judiciary, what is the presidency, what is the relationship to the military, as well as all sorts of other functions that that governments need to have in place in order to function. Very importantly, for instance, it also governs how often there should be elections. So part of the fear with all of these changes that are being made is if there are no checks and balances on the government to amend basic laws, there is actually nothing stopping the government from, with a simple majority, stopping any further elections. It might not happen, but it is very possible to happen. And in fact, many people over the years had warned on both sides of the political spectrum that this is a challenge that Israel should respond to. And there have been attempts since the 50s. The last big attempt was in the early 2000s to draft a constitution. It never really went anywhere. But over and over, there have been attempts at that, and there's talk about this again now. I'm not sure how hopeful I am that it will make a big difference. The biggest changes to the basic laws and to the way that the basic laws functioned in relationship to the Supreme Court came in the 1990s, when Aharon Barak was the head of the Supreme Court. Just to understand how the Supreme Court, right, the Supreme Court is appointed by this committee, judicial committee, which the government also wants to change, which is a combination of representatives of the government and representatives from the legal profession and so on. And then the head of the Supreme Court at the moment is purely based on seniority. So whoever is the judge who's been sitting the longest becomes the head of the court, and appointments are until the legal retirement age of 67 for Supreme Court justices. So they're not lifetime appointments, but they are until the age of 67. So when Aharon Barak was in charge of the Supreme Court, two things happened. First, the Knesset passed two basic laws dealing with human rights. The basic law called freedom of occupation, primarily around labor law and human rights around employment rights, and so on. And the basic law, human dignity and freedom, which is really a sort of legislation to say people are entitled to equality before the law. People, they shouldn't face discrimination based on race, gender, sexuality, and so on. And actually, Israel is quite modern and advanced with its equality legislation. So, for instance, Israel has much better legal protection of people with disabilities and their rights in the workplace than even most other Western democracies. Israel has very strong legislation about racial discrimination. Doesn't mean that it always happens, but the legislation actually is very good. And when cases are brought to the courts, actually the courts are pretty good. So these two basic laws were put in place in 1992. And in 1995, under Aharon Barak, the Supreme Court ruled for the first time that it should have the right to strike down other laws that contradict basic laws without meeting the required criteria. So that it should say, you can't pass a law which treats men and women unequally, or you can't pass a law which discriminates on the basis of sexuality. And as you can imagine, right-wing, ultra-Orthodox, sometimes Islamist, don't necessarily love all those clauses around equality and so on. If you think back to last week's session, right, some of the groups that were very active are very clearly associated with these values of equality, whether it's the Reform movement in Israel or the women's movement, LGBTQ groups, and so on, right? Because they actually enjoyed a lot of protection because of these basic rights. Now, the question is, so what the right wing claimed was the Supreme Court was overstepping its authority. It's not elected, and it was just interfering with government running its doing its business. In fact, the Supreme Court has been extremely restrained in applying its rights to strike down laws since 1995. Anyone want to have a guess how many laws it struck down? By the way, the Knesset is super active, so it's like hundreds of laws each year. So Paul said 2, bit more than 2. 22, actually. So 22 laws it struck down, but literally Israel proposes like hundreds of laws each year. So 22 times it has in fact struck down a law. But it's not like it's crazy super active all the time and interfering with what the government is doing. In fact, most of the time, if there is a petition, the court had ruled against that petition. Up until 2024, we'll get to 2024, the court had never struck down a basic law. So the 22 laws that it struck down were just ordinary laws. It had never struck down a basic law. It discussed in 2021 whether it should have the right to strike down a basic law when the nation-state bill was discussed. However, it concluded that that was not, it was not significant enough, that the basic law did not gravely violate the notion of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, and therefore it did not feel it had sufficient grounds. Now, for instance, the Druze community said very clearly, you are not treating us equal because the nation state law gave superior status to Jewish citizens of Israel. And it demoted Arabic from being to no longer being an official language. So Druze citizens in particular feel especially aggrieved by the nation state law and say, actually, in our opinion, it does violate the basic law of human dignity and freedom because it doesn't treat us equally. However, at that time, the Supreme Court decided not to overrule the Knesset. When has the court intervened? In the majority of cases, when the court has applied the reasonableness clause in particular, it hasn't been around laws, but about positions taken by the executive. So, for instance, one of those cases was the so for instance, what decisions by the Attorney General on whether to launch criminal investigations or issue indictments. So, for instance, there was a case, a legal case, and it was about corruption. The heads of the banks were accused of participating in manipulations of the stock market. And the Attorney General had made a decision not to charge the heads of the banks. And the court ruled that that was unreasonable, that they should be, the heads of the banks should be indicted, and there should be a proper court case to see if they should be held legally liable. The other aspect where the court has intervened are political appointments. Again, not in a huge number of cases, but in a small number of cases where the court has ruled that the decision to appoint an individual to a certain position or not to remove someone from a position was extremely unreasonable. For instance, it ruled that the decision of the government not to dismiss Minister Aryeh Deri when he was finance minister and he was accused of serious corruption, that was unreasonable. That if you are accused of serious corruption and you're a finance minister, that is unreasonable. So it really is a fairly high bar, but there have been times when the court has intervened, generally not to strike down laws. There are also, it's not just like it's all like at some point in this debate, people started to portray this is lefty versus right wingers, and rich Tel Avivi secular people versus ordinary traditional religious people. But actually, the court has applied the reasonableness principle in a number of cases that had nothing to do with lefty stuff. So, for instance, in 2007, it ruled the decision by the Minister of Defense not to install protection against rocket attacks in classrooms in the city of Sderot as unreasonable because it was an unreasonable immediate danger to students that they would have to run to the public protective spaces. And that it, in fact, should be a government responsibility to make classrooms rocket safe. You have to remember with Sderot, right? Now, I probably don't have to say it so much anymore because we're much more familiar with the region since 7th of October. But Sderot is very close to the Gaza Strip, has faced rocket attacks for several decades, right? This is a 2007 case. And it's close enough that you normally have between 10 and 15 seconds to run to the nearest safe room. So one of the things that the Supreme Court said is, government, you actually have a responsibility to protect pupils. Not exactly. And Sderot by the way, right-wing hotbed, definitely not a lefty Tel Aviv space. So definitely not just a lefty issue. 2005, it ruled that the government suddenly decided no longer to automatically recognize the doctoral degrees that were done by foreign universities. And the Supreme Court ruled that that was completely unreasonable because there were a whole bunch of students who had started their doctoral degrees thinking they would be recognized, and suddenly the government said they won't be recognized. If you want to come back, you have to do stuff again. Again, not really a lefty or righty thing. It was just about justice and equality and so on. And it said the government is acting unreasonably here. Final one that I wanted to share, 2014, it ruled that it was unreasonable that the government refused to build a mikveh, a ritual bath, for women in the town of Kfar Vradim. There was a mikveh for men, but not a mikveh for women. And the government said this is completely unreasonable. This is part of this is women's rights. You should, sorry, the court said to the government, this is unreasonable. You should implement this. So what we see here is the court doesn't just like pull out of a hat and say, oh, you know, you're unreasonable, we want to overrule you. In most cases, what the court did was it told the government, fix it. We're not going to overrule you. We're just going to say, fix it. We identify here there is a problem of equality. Go back and fix it. Nevertheless, it was often seen as pesky. Now, there were lots of the left actually also had lots of complaints to the Supreme Court. So, for instance, especially the pro-Palestinian anti-occupation left were very disappointed with many of the court's rulings, where the court ruled that Palestinians weren't the rightful owners of properties, or where the court ruled that the separation fence was allowed to run through Palestinian land because it did not cause unnecessary hardship for the Palestinians and so on. So it's not like the court is loved by one side and hated by the other. It's very much sometimes it worked in your favor and sometimes it didn't. However, Yariv Levin, the justice minister, and Simcha Rotman were total disciples ever since like the late 90s. They started kind of their law career in those years. They've been advocating that the Supreme Court should have almost no power. It should all just be the government. Let's come back to where we were, right? So last time, session one, we finished on Netanyahu firing his defense minister on the 26th of March. So yesterday, 1 year ago, it's unbelievable to think about that. So 27th of March, the national unions hold their first general strike in I don't know how many decades. Everyone goes on strike. It's complete chaos. I remember that night I was like on the phone with my friends all night. I was in the UK still. And it really felt like there was going to be a civil war. Like everyone was like completely up in arms. Netanyahu realizes things are going completely pear-shaped. He announces that day on the 27th that he's going to pause the process and return to the negotiation tables. However, by the 26th of June, the government declares we won't agree to a compromise. We will not go there, and they start the advancement of what became known as the reasonableness clause, namely the clause to abolish the reasonableness doctrine that we just spoke about. What does it mean to advance a law? This is like a little bit of Israeli legal structure 101. So in order for a law to pass in the Israeli Knesset, there are several stages. The first step is that the law must be presented to the Constitution, Law and Justice Committee. Any law that goes to the Knesset has to go through the Constitution, Law and Justice Committee. The head of the Constitution, Law and Justice Committee at the moment is Simcha Rotman, one of the disciples of this judicial overhaul. The previous incumbent was Rabbi Gilad Kariv, Reform Rabbi Gilad Kariv. So it's a very, very powerful position because any law that gets blocked in the committee can't make it onto the Knesset floor. So on the 26th of June, the committee decides to advance the bill and move it to the first reading and list it for the first reading in the Knesset. There are 3 readings. You normally have to do the first reading separately, and then the second and the third reading are done in, unless there's something unusual that happens, are done one after the other. They're basically 2 consecutive votes, one after the other happening. The only time that things go really pear-shaped is if somebody falls asleep. It happened, by the way, in the last government with the budget vote. They were voting like till 3 in the morning, and the government had a very, very narrow majority. And one of the ministers of Knesset, she fell asleep in her office and she missed the vote, and the bill had to go, the budget bill had to go back to committee. It was a big embarrassment, completely not what anyone hoped. But normally between second and third reading, you don't need to do anything. So on the 26th of June, the first step is taken to list the bill and propose it for the first reading to be read on the 10th of July, 2023. As a result, the protest movement ramps up its activity. And one of the first things that happened is that the demonstrators start to use roadblocks as part of the road blocking as part of the protests, much more significantly. Until that moment, they basically had permission from the police that a road would be closed where the demonstration would take place, but not the blocking of public motorways. But so road blocking becomes part of the strategy. There's a lot of talk about what different forms of protests should happen when. The other thing that happens is the first big demonstration at Ben Gurion Airport happened. So the video I'm going to show you is from Ben Gurion Airport. On the 26th of June, protesters stormed Ben Gurion Airport to protest there, and the airport is open, so people are arriving. If you've ever arrived at Ben Gurion, you will recognize the place. Oh, now my video is not playing. 1 second, we're gonna have to fix that. This is the problem. I think I might have too many videos. So sometimes they might need a moment till they start. 1 second. Let me share again. Let's see if this works. Oh no. Oh no, oh no, oh no. Why is it not working? 1 second. This is very disappointing. I'll find it. Otherwise, I'll have to play it not in the presentation. Let's see. Apologies for that. Doesn't want to play. Well, I'll find it for you in moment. Actually, let me just open it on a different thing. Where do I? Ben Gurion. I'll open in a different. Oh, now it's saying the audio play feedback thing is in use. That is interesting. Let's see if it is actually in use. Maybe it's something different. Let me see. Sorry, I don't think this has happened to me. Let's see. Now I've got the video. There we are. There you go. So you get the idea. Really, tens of thousands stormed Ben Gurion Airport to protest. This is on the 26th of June. From the 26th of June onwards, what we see is we start seeing the protests really ramping up towards this first reading of the bill. Interestingly, what happens is that on the 5th of July, the head of the police of Tel Aviv Police, Amichai Eshed, decides to join the protest, the Saturday night protests. He speaks at the protest because he is being sanctioned by the government that he doesn't use enough force against the demonstrators. And he speaks about the fact that he's being asked by the government to use disproportionate force against peaceful demonstrators. And what we will see, hopefully we won't have total failure with all my videos, is that the police violence increases significantly from that moment. The protests were unbelievably peaceful. I think it's really important to say that going to the protests is like, it was events that kids went to, parents went with their kids. It was not something that felt in any way dangerous or risky. And it really was something that was, at most it caused traffic disruption, but it really wasn't something where that none of the protesters were violent. There were a few occasions when people lit fires on the road. So in those cases, it's probably reasonable that the police interfered, but police violence really goes up. The chief of police of Tel Aviv actually ends up resigning on the 9th of July in protests because of the bill. And it's really important to understand that by this point, the protest movement really has been joined by numerous politicians, heads of the bank, from all fields of life, numerous former right-wing politicians, previous prime ministers, and so on. So it really was not something that reflected a niche group. It reflected the majority of people. So on the 10th of July, as was expected, although people were still, like, I remember the sense of shock, on the 10th of July, the reasonableness clause comes to its first reading and passes its first reading. On that day, the organizers of the protests in Tel Aviv decide for the first time it's really important. It's not totally the first time. There was one previous occasion. It's really important that we all come to Tel Aviv, come to Jerusalem. So masses and masses arrived on 10th of July for the protest. It was really unbelievable. I hope to be able to show you 2 videos next. I'll introduce them and then we'll watch them one after the other. The first is a short clip of the train from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and you will see there is nobody on the train who isn't coming to the demonstration. And I want you to pay attention to the people on the train, the different T-shirts they're wearing, right? We talked about the different T-shirts, but also that you see it's a Tel Aviv crowd, so it's basically a secular crowd. The next video that I hope to show is the video of the march. It's in the evening. It's a video I took myself as we were walking. Basically, what happened was there were sort of 2 flows of demonstrations happening. The group that started in Jerusalem, that were walking from one side of the Knesset, past the big park. We'll see the park in a little bit again. Past the park, and then you kind of come round up, but past the Supreme Court, and then toward the Knesset. And the group from Tel Aviv that were coming from the train station pouring in from that side, and it was a total bottleneck. But what you'll see in the video Jerusalem is you start seeing the religious symbolism, because Tel Aviv secular, but Jerusalem broad religious symbolism. So hopefully these videos will not disappoint us. So let's see what happens. So you see here, there's like this there was a combination of feeling of total despair and kind of, wow, we're not alone, we're coming together, right? So there's like, people are smiling and like, showing the victory sign, but they're about to really lose big. I mean, this was like not a moment really of celebration, but a moment of defeat also. So next video is Jerusalem. So you can't quite hear the shofar, but I hope you were able to see the shofarot in the video. So there were people standing on the bridge. The bridge is the bridge towards the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is like on the left. You saw the crowds were basically not moving anymore, because this was like total bottleneck of thousands and thousands of people coming together. So this is on the 10th of July, huge demonstration. From that moment on already, there are daily protests, not like one protest, but like you could do nothing but protests in those days. Local protests, like I went to the mall just outside Jerusalem where I was staying, and there were like people like, oh, come, we're going to protest for a little bit on the bridge, just come with us. And there were these small pop-up protests everywhere all the time, in front of politicians' houses, at embassies and so on. On the 18th of July, the organizers of the Tel Aviv protests decide we need something momentous, preparing for it's clear that the Knesset will vote on the 24th of July, will vote on the 2nd and 3rd reading on the bill. So there isn't much time. The organizers decide the next Saturday protest before the reading of the 2nd and 3rd reading should be, the big protest should be in Jerusalem, not in Tel Aviv. It leads to some interesting tensions between the different protest groups, because Jerusalem had a very different feeling to it than Tel Aviv, and it felt a little bit like Tel Aviv was swamping Jerusalem. And actually on the 22nd, on the 22nd, at first, there are two protests. There's Jerusalem in one corner and there's Tel Aviv in another corner, although Tel Aviv had way better technology, so you couldn't really hear Jerusalem because you could only hear the screens from Tel Aviv, from the Tel Aviv groups. But it was a real moment. But on the 18th of July, the organizers decide we are going to walk from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It's 40 miles from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, about 65 kilometers. And at first there were just a few hundreds, then a few thousands. In the end, many tens of thousands participated. Josh and I joined the last stretch on the last Saturday on the 22nd. It's the last 8 or so kilometers. It's not that far, but if you know Jerusalem or the route from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the 8 kilometers are like 8 kilometers up the hill, and walking on a highway, no shade. So I'm going to show you two videos. One is a video that was produced by the organizers. You will see some of the organizers some of the people that I introduced in last week's session in it. And it's a video that was done before the march reached Jerusalem. And then the second video is a family who took the video from their car. You hear them chatting in the background, where you can see how long the stretch was where people were walking. It's like it was over a mile that in the end that the people stretched over. That's how many people it was. And it was like unbelievable. You couldn't tell how many people there were because it was just people everywhere. So hopefully these videos will run. Let's see.
I think this is the most important fight on Israeli story.
We left everything aside to make sure that the only democracy in the Middle East will remain democracy, and that the future of Israel as we know it will be secured.
I'm fighting here for my parents, for my grandparents, and for my kids. I don't have any other option.
וואו, זה פשוט לא יאומן. וואו, איך זה מרגש. תראו כמה. תראו, זה לא נגמר.
He's saying, look how many. Look.
וואו, זה מדהים.
It's incredible.
מדהים. וואו, איזה מדהימים.
וואו. וואו, טואן.
זה לא נגמר, אני מצלמת את הכל וזה עוד לא נגמר.
It's just never, it's not ending, it's never ending. I'm filming the whole
זה
lot.
באמת עשרות אלפים.
גם אנשים הלכו לצד השני.
וואו.
The girl says, oh, there are other people on the other side and on the bridge.
וכל האנשים האלה רוצים לצעוק בקול אחד גדול.
And everyone wants to shout in one voice.
אנחנו רוצים דמוקרטיה וחופש.
They want democracy and freedom.
דמוקרטיה.
דמוקרטיה.
So you get kind of a sense of really how huge it was. And it was unbelievably hot. This was the height of a massive heat wave. And really people came from all over the country to walk together. As in the video it said, the protest movement announced we will stay in Jerusalem until democracy is protected. Well, not quite, but they decided to stay in a spontaneous camp city at the foot of the Knesset, starting from the 22nd of July until the 24th of July. I think initially, all of these plans were not really planned in advance. Everyone was just kind of going with the flow. So what happened on the 22nd of July, they just suddenly decided we're going to do this. And then people from High Tech suddenly donated tents. We'll see in a moment a picture of the tents. So on the 22nd, big demonstrations. There's art being set up. I didn't mention this before. One of the groups that became really vocal in the protest movement were families of soldiers that had been killed in action. And there was an artist, Itai Tzalait, who designed this artwork. It was initially set up in Tel Aviv here. It's entitled Lashav, in vain. It then was moved to Jerusalem. You can see here in the small picture that it's medals. People had given the medals that their loved ones had been awarded who'd fallen, and families wrote on these posters the memories of their loved ones and that they didn't want them to have died in vain. So artists move in, right? We talked about artists before. We'll talk about that again. We're going to talk about the tent city in just a moment that emerged. But what also happened is people decided, now we're in Jerusalem, so we're going to do Jerusalem stuff. So they decided on the morning of the 23rd of July, people would gather at the Kotel at the Western Wall, and then would form a human chain all the way from the Western Wall to the Knesset. Different groups participated. The Reform movement had their corner, so we actually got a really good spot because it was in the shade. So the different groups kind of lined up, and then people were walking past till they could find an empty space in the human chain. So on the next slide, you'll see a photograph of the Kotel, and then a little video that I took as we were standing along the road there, or not a video. Let's see if it might get itself going. No, 1 second. We're going to try this once to see if I can get this activated, because it would be a bit of a shame if we don't have it. 1 second, sorry. Let's make sure that, let's see if these videos will work. Try again. Oh. And you can see in Jerusalem, right, also a religious crowd, not just a regular crowd, also. And it took about, I would say, almost an hour for the quite of the old city here in the background. So clearly some of the Orthodox girls, right? People with tzitzit, very diverse crowd in Jerusalem that participated in the protest. The tent city was up for 2 nights. The first night I sort of looked at it and went like, oh my God, people are completely nuts. And then my friend said, Leah, we cannot miss history. We're going to sleep in this park. And I was like, I don't do camping. I really don't do camping. And she said, no, Leah, it's glamping. they give you a tent. And I was like, it's not glamping. I have a cardboard box as a mattress. That's not glamping in my eyes. But I decided nonetheless I was going to do this. And it was an incredible atmosphere. The video that you'll see hopefully working is, again, I took it from the vantage point of my little tent. You will see all the tents are the same because people donated, or almost all of them are the same. People donated the tents. You will see in the pictures on the side kind of all the other things that are going on. And once the sound kind of the video is over, I'll say a bit more. So there you had the pop-up cinema. My friend who convinced me to sleep in the park. So you'll see the tent city, the whole thing in another video in a moment as well. But it really was incredible. So there was this supply point where you could go and you could say, it's 2 of us, and then they gave you a tent of the right size. And by the time we got there were no more mattresses left. So that hence we had one of those lovely cardboard boxes to sleep on. In the morning, people came and brought home baked goods. It was really incredible. Of course, you couldn't have an Israeli event overnight without being able to charge your phone. So you could just leave your phone there, and people really just abandoned their phone, and then they would announce over the speaker, so come and pick up your phone, it's finished charging. You can't see the wonderful portaloos that suddenly appeared. I was like, oh my God, what is this? Where did they suddenly get 50 portaloos from? In this picture, this is one of my favorite moments is Rabbi Gilad Kariv, member of Knesset for Avodah. He was, I think, the only member of Knesset who decided to also sleep in the park the night before the vote. And you see him surrounded with lots of young people, and he really was sat there patiently explaining democracy and how government works, how laws are passed, and so on. It really was a very special, very, very special moment. However, the atmosphere was tense. It was clear that things were going to be challenging. The next morning, the Knesset was going to do the second and third reading. We woke up early because you always wake up early. I should say during the night, there were a number of times when people in cars came past and shouted abuse. So it wasn't that everyone was in favor of this, but nothing too bad happened. The next morning, we woke up to the water cannons pointing at us. So I will see if the video works. So here you see the water cannon, my lovely portaloos, lots of trees, lots and lots of trees, and we were probably somewhere in there, around there. So then the Knesset vote. I'm gonna show you a clip, hopefully it'll work. It's kind of a summary clip of Knesset voting. The Knesset in the end voted 64-0, I think, because all the opposition lawmakers left out of protest. In the second reading, there were still some there. You can see on the faces of the people, kind of they're like in shock even. And then on the side of the government, they have like these grins of like, oh, we can just show them we are the bosses. So pay attention to people's how people are looking. Now the video, of course, doesn't start. I had kind of a thought that might happen. So let me just see if I can find this video on my computer in another way, or maybe otherwise I'll try once more to see if it works like this. Too many videos. The reality is doesn't work. Okay. Let's try that and see.
52 בעד, 65
עודד
נגד
פורר,
ההסתייגות.
אינו נוכח יצחק פינדרוס, בעד, אינו נוכח שרן מרים השכל, אינה נוכחת יאסר חוג'יראת, אינו נוכח, אינה נוכחת
חבר הכנסת להב הרצנו, קריאה שלישית, נא לצאת. חבר הכנסת להב הרצנו, שלישית לצאת.
מרב מיכאלי, נגד שלי טל מירון, נגד
So here really peaceful protest. People were just sitting on the street and they were water cannons.
Democracy in our country.
So here you see the tent city, how large it was. So on the 24th of July, the government rules to abolish the reasonableness clause. It basically says it's a very simple text. It says that the Supreme Court will not discuss the reasonableness of decisions made by the government, the Prime Minister, or any other minister, and will not issue orders in this regard. It was really a moment of, it felt like utter defeat. The water cannons were out. They were also using the skunk water, so it was really super smelly. So here's me with various people from the reform movement, and everyone was holding rosemary under their noses because you could otherwise, the smell was so bad. And it was really just a peaceful demonstration. This video is now not working, but it's basically, again, it was a bunch of students just sitting in the night on an intersection where nobody wants to go. It's like blocks the road between the Supreme Court and the Foreign Ministry, when really in the middle of the night, nobody wants to go, and the police really violently breaking up the demonstrations. So as we're rapidly running out of time because my video failure, what happens next? So the Supreme Court receives pretty much immediately 8 petitions against the law. There's a moment where people are like, Demokratia umeret, is this the moment when revolt should happen? The decision is made by the protest movement to wait for the ruling of the Supreme Court. Everyone says it's going to be a catastrophe, though, because what happens if the Supreme Court applies the reasonableness clause in order to overrule the law that abolishes that clause? It's like the definition of a constitutional crisis. There was a lot of debate. What would the police do in that case? What would the army do in that case? As I said, the Supreme Court had never before decided on a petition against a basic law that really was about it. The Supreme Court decides to hear the case with every single one of the judges sitting. It was a full 13-hour hearing with 15 Supreme Court justices sitting. Normally, cases are heard by 5, 7, 9, or a maximum of 11 justices. It was the first time in history that all 15 justices heard the case. The Attorney General refused to represent the government because she decided that she actually sided with the petitioners that the law must be struck down. So the government was given permission. It's highly unusual. Normally, the Attorney General has to defend the government in Supreme Court hearings. They were allowed to have private counsel. The protest, basically, the petition is heard. It's 30, or the 8 petitions are heard. It's 13 hours of hearings. It's a performance of the government ministers in propaganda. And the protest movement continues. The protests go back to weekly protests. Like I said, it was important to kind of capture different atmospheres because you needed to kind of make sure that people were still coming. There were different themes. You then started also to kind of get the artistic impressions right. So these two T-shirts behind me are part of this initiative, actually by Yotam Doktor, who is the owner of one of the restaurants that is near where the protests were taking place. And he was looking for ideas to support the protest movement. And he asked designers to design T-shirts as part of a series called Dressed to Protest, because he said that the protest T-shirts weren't creative enough. And there were, I think, 15 different T-shirts designs that were created. I didn't buy 15 T-shirts. But you can see different examples. These two are ones that I have here. And then the different protests were picking up on themes, right? We talked about this last time: women's rights, education, violence in Arab cities, and so on. So each week kind of had a protest. And the protest continued and continued and continued. And actually, they only came to a stop because of the 7th of October. There were very few weeks, I think a couple of weeks because of rockets from Gaza beforehand already, that the protests stopped, but protests were kept going and going. This was just after the reasonableness clause was passed. So beginning of August, I think, this banner, "We've just started," and then Bassof Nenatzer, in the end we will win. And what, you know, the protest movement really kept saying is, you know, eventually we will win. We are the smart people. We are on the right side. Eventually we will win. You can see there was a lot of Nazi imagery revoked. Lots of like, "This is fascism." So you have Mein Kampf or Israel über alles, but or other iconic images kind of taken and adopted as well. I'm going to leave you with Bassof Nenatzer. In the end, we will prevail, or we will win. Of course, after the 7th of October, and we'll come to that next time, the slogan became "Beyachad Nenatzer," together we shall prevail. Now that it's almost 2024, that it's already 2024, the Beyachad Nenatzer people are starting to question again. I should give you a glimpse of where does this story go in case you didn't follow it. The Supreme Court does rule on the petitions. It had a deadline of having to rule by the 12th of January because 2 of the justices were had retired, and they have 3 months between retirement and issuing their verdict. So it was clear it was going to have to be at the latest 12th of January, the ruling. However, it was leaked that the court would rule against the government at the end of December, and Shas tried to introduce legislation to change how long justices had after retirement to write verdicts so that they could delay writing the verdict, because they said, "We don't want during war a potentially divisive ruling." So the court decided to actually not give Shas a chance to sidetrack them, and published their ruling on the 1st of January, ruling striking down the law, ruling for the first time. First, it issued a ruling on 2 different cases. One was the procedural, where 13 out of 15 judges agreed that, in fact, they had the power to strike down a basic law. And then, in the end, the court ruled with a majority. I can't remember now exactly what size majority. It was a clear majority, but it wasn't 13 out of 15. that in fact the law did contravene the standard of reasonableness, and therefore they should strike down the law. And so currently we are in the stage of nobody quite knows. The government hasn't really got their act together because there is a war. So it's sort of hanging somewhere, but at the moment the reasonableness clause is not in effect. So the law that was passed was annulled by the court again. So we kind of build our way up to the passing of the law, and then as we're leaving 2023 behind, the law gets struck down again. Next week we're gonna meet to talk about post October the 7th. Wish me luck. I'm not quite sure yet how I'm gonna do the tension of it. I hope this was interesting. I apologize that we're slightly over with our time. I'm gonna stop the recording. If people want to have questions or want to make comments, you're welcome to still stick around. But I understand that it's late and you might want to just go to sleep. So thank you very much.